The first time I realized my family had written me out of my own life was the morning I received a wedding invitation addressed to everyone but me. Not metaphorically, literally. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, expensive. My parents' handwriting was unmistakable. Inside was an invitation to my younger sister's wedding at a vineyard outside Santa Ynez. It listed my parents by name, my brother and his wife, even my aunt, who hadn't spoken to anyone in 10 years. Then, at the bottom, a line that made my stomach drop. Children of the family are welcome. No mention of me. No +1. No mistake. I was 32 years old, standing in my kitchen in Sacramento, holding proof that I no longer officially existed. My name is Eleanor Price. Most people call me Ellie. I work in compliance for a mid-sized manufacturing firm, the kind of job that teaches you how power hides behind paperwork. I'd spent the last decade building a quiet, solid life after leaving my parents' house at 22. No drama, no explosions, just distance. Or so I thought. I called my mother, Judith Price, because that's what daughters like me are trained to do. Give people a chance to explain their cruelty away. She answered on the second ring, too cheerful. "Oh good, you got it," she said, before I'd said a word. Got what? I asked, though we both knew. The invitation. Isn't it lovely? Caroline chose the font herself. I waited. Silence has always been my strongest tool. People fill it with the truth if you let them. There was a pause, a sigh, the familiar one. The sigh that meant I was about to be unreasonable. Again. "We assumed you wouldn't want to come," my mother said carefully. "Given everything." "What everything?" I asked. "You know," she replied. "Your attitude, your history with the family." We didn't want to upset Caroline on her big day. Caroline. Always Caroline. My younger sister by 4 years. The golden child. The one whose mistakes were called phases and whose successes were called destiny. I looked around my kitchen. The mortgage I paid, alone. The promotion I'd earned, without help. The life I'd built, without them. "I wasn't invited," I said flatly. "You weren't excluded," my mother corrected. "We just didn't think it was appropriate." There it was. The word they always used when they wanted to sound reasonable while taking something from me. "I'll let you go," she added quickly. "We're finalizing the seating chart." The line went dead. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I sat at my kitchen table and noticed, with a strange detachment, that my hands were steady. That should have been my warning. 3 days later, my brother Daniel texted me a screenshot. "Hey, weird question," he wrote. "Why aren't you listed as a beneficiary anymore?" I stared at the message until the words blurred. "What do you mean?" I typed back. "Mom asked me to sign something at Dad's office. Updated estate documents. You're not on them. At all." My father, Richard Price, owned Price & Sons Industrial Supply, family business, started by my grandfather. The same grandfather who used to say I had the sharpest mind of all his grandchildren. The same grandfather who left explicit instructions in his will that all 3 of his grandchildren be treated equally. I called my father next. He didn't answer. I drove to their house that evening, unannounced. Old habits die hard. The house looked the same. White columns, circular driveway, Christmas wreath still hanging in March because my mother liked things to look festive longer than necessary. Inside, Judith sat at the dining table with a stack of folders. Caroline was there too, glowing, manicured, wearing a ring that probably cost more than my car. "Oh," Caroline said when she saw me. "You came." I nodded. "Apparently." Judith stood. "Ellie, this isn't a good time." "It never is," I said. "I have a simple question. Why am I no longer included in the estate?" Caroline's smile tightened. She looked at my mother, then at me, like she was humoring a difficult coworker. "Because you're not involved," she said. "You left. You don't contribute to the family business." It didn't make sense. "I was never invited to contribute," I replied. My father finally spoke from the doorway. This was a practical decision. I turned to him. "Grandpa's will was outdated," Judith cut in. "Times change." I noticed something then. A manila envelope on the table. My name typed on a label. Not inside the folders. On top. Like an afterthought. "What's that?" I asked. Judith slid it toward me without meeting my eyes. A settlement. Inside was a single sheet. A proposed agreement. I would receive a one-time payment in exchange for signing away any future claims to the family business, inheritance, or trust. The number was insulting. Caroline leaned back in her chair. This way there's no conflict later. Clean break. A clean break. As if I were the problem that needed removing. I thought of Christmas mornings, where my gifts were smaller. Birthdays forgotten until dinner. Thanksgiving dinners, where I cooked and cleared plates, while Caroline was praised for existing. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I won't be signing this, I said. Judith's expression hardened. Then you leave us no choice. No choice to do what? I asked. She smiled. Not warmly, not kindly. To proceed without you. I walked out without another word. I didn't slam the door. I didn't look back. That night, I pulled out a box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were old documents. Copies of my grandfather's original will, emails, notes, things I'd kept without knowing why. At the bottom was a business card I'd forgotten I had. A lawyer. Estate litigation. A name my grandfather once told me to remember, just in case. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't know it yet, but my family had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Because I was done asking to be included, and I was about to remind them that silence is not the same as surrender. I didn't call the lawyer the next morning. That surprised me. Instead, I went to work like nothing had happened. I sat in traffic, I drank burnt office coffee, I reviewed compliance reports and signed off on documents that determined whether companies lived or died by regulation. On the surface, my life stayed intact. Inside, something had shifted. When you grow up in a family like mine, you learn early that reacting is dangerous. Emotion gets used against you. Tears become proof of instability. Anger becomes evidence you're difficult. So you survive by observing, by storing details, by waiting. That was what I was doing now. At lunch, Daniel called. They're serious, he said without preamble. Mom's telling people you cut yourself off from the family. Did I? I asked. He exhaled. Ellie. Did I? I repeated. No, he admitted. But that's the story. I pictured my mother at her book club, her church group, her bridge nights, sighing sadly as she explained how her eldest daughter had always been complicated. Why are you calling me? I asked. There was a pause. Because I don't understand it anymore. Dad's been different, angry. Caroline's acting like she won something. And now there's paperwork moving fast. What paperwork? They're transferring shares. Quietly, before the wedding. That got my attention. Price & Sons wasn't just a family business. It was a holding company with subsidiaries, property, and a trust structure my grandfather had designed to make sure no single person could hijack it. Unless they were very careful. Or very dishonest. Did you sign? I asked. No, Daniel said. I told them I needed time. I closed my office door. Don't sign anything. Not yet. Ellie, what are you planning? I'm planning to understand what they're doing, I said, before they finish doing it. That evening, I drove to my grandmother's old house. She'd passed away 3 years earlier. The house had been empty since, waiting to be sold. Or so I'd been told. In reality, my parents kept it untouched. A shrine to the past they liked to reference but never revisit. I still had a key. The house smelled like dust and lemon polish. I turned on lamps one by one, illuminating furniture frozen in time. On the wall hung a photo of my grandparents with their 3 grandchildren, me in the middle, smiling, uncropped. I went straight to the study. My grandfather, Thomas Price, had been meticulous. Every important document was labeled, dated, and cross-referenced. He trusted systems more than people, and for good reason. The file cabinet was locked, but the key was exactly where it had always been, inside a hollowed-out book of Shakespeare plays. He used to say the best hiding places were the ones people dismissed as sentimental. I pulled out the drawers slowly. Wills, trust amendments, correspondence with attorneys, notes written in his precise handwriting. And then I saw it. A letter addressed to me, not mailed, never sent. Ellie, if you are reading this, something has gone wrong. My throat tightened, but my hands stayed steady. I trust you more than anyone else to see clearly. Your parents mean well, but they value harmony over honesty. That can become dangerous when money is involved. The trust was designed to protect you, Daniel, and Caroline equally. Any attempt to remove one beneficiary without cause invalidates the distribution. If they try, you must act quickly. I sat back in the chair, heart pounding. There it was. Not suspicion, not paranoia. Proof. My grandfather had anticipated this. I took photos of everything, every document, every margin note. I scanned what I could using my phone, emailing copies to a private account I'd created years ago for exactly this kind of thing. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I cataloged. By midnight, I knew enough to understand the shape of the betrayal. My parents weren't just cutting me out emotionally. They were trying to erase me financially before Caroline's wedding, when assets would be harder to challenge without causing a scene. Classic. I drove home, exhausted but calm. The next morning, I called the lawyer. His name was Samuel Green, 72 years old, sharp voice, no nonsense. I was wondering when you'd call, he said, after I introduced myself. You knew? I asked. I advised your grandfather, he replied. He worried about this scenario. I explained everything. The invitation, the settlement, the quiet transfers. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a brief silence. Do not sign anything, he said. Do not confront them. And do not let them know you're aware of the trust provisions. What should I do? I asked. Nothing, he said. Yet. I frowned. Nothing? You've been excluded, he continued. That gives you leverage. People make mistakes when they think you're powerless. I thought of my mother's smile, Caroline's confidence, my father's avoidance. They think you'll go quietly, Samuel said. Let them. A chill ran through me. We'll file when the timing is right, he added. But first, I want copies of everything you found. I sent them that afternoon. 2 days later, Caroline posted engagement photos at the vineyard. Golden light, perfect angles. Comments flooded in. Heart emojis. Congratulations. So happy for you. My mother shared them with a caption about family and blessings. I wasn't tagged. That night, I received another text from Daniel. They're telling people you declined the invitation because you're busy with work. I smiled for the first time in days. Let them, I typed back. Because while they were polishing the image of a perfect family, I was preparing something far less visible. Paperwork, filings, deadlines, the kind of things that don't look dramatic until it's too late. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, one thought kept looping through my mind. They thought removing me would make things simpler. What they didn't realize was that I'd spent my entire life being underestimated. And this time, I wasn't going to disappear quietly. The first official notice arrived by certified mail on a Thursday afternoon. I recognized the return address immediately. Price & Sons Industrial Supply, Legal Department. I didn't open it right away. I placed the envelope on my kitchen counter, poured myself a glass of water, and sat down. When you've lived under quiet threats your entire life, you learn that the anticipation is often worse than the message. I waited until my pulse slowed. Inside was exactly what Samuel had predicted, a formal notice of intent to restructure the family trust. No explanation, no apology, just language so clean and neutral, it almost felt insulting. Phrases like operational efficiency, simplified governance, and aligned beneficiaries. My name appeared once, in a list titled Removed Parties. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. They had moved. That evening, Samuel called me himself. He rarely did that, unless something mattered. They filed without notifying you directly, he said. That's not an accident. Is it legal? I asked. Barely, he replied. And only if no one challenges it in time. How much time do I have? 30 days, he said. But we won't wait that long. I stared out my apartment window at the city lights. What happens if we file now? They'll know you're aware, Samuel said. They'll circle the wagons, deny access, claim misunderstanding. And if we wait, they'll get comfortable, he said. They'll make mistakes. I didn't hesitate. We wait. There was a pause on the line. Approval, I realized. Good, he said. In the meantime, I need you to do something. Name it. I want you to document your role in the company, Samuel said. Every interaction, every request you made to be included, every time you were ignored. That goes back years, I said. Yes, he replied. which is why it matters. After we hung up, I opened a new document on my laptop. I titled it simply, Timeline. I didn't embellish. I didn't vent. I wrote dates, facts, emails, meetings I'd asked to attend. The summer I'd offered to help with logistics when Daniel went on medical leave. The time my father said, "This isn't really your world, Ellie," with a smile that was meant to soften the blow. It took hours. Around midnight, I found something I hadn't expected. An email from 5 years earlier, from my mother. Subject line, Family Roles. I read it slowly. Ellie, we think it's best if you focus on your own career. The business is complex, and Caroline has a natural aptitude for it. We don't want you to feel overshadowed. I stared at the screen. They hadn't just excluded me. They'd framed it as protection. I forwarded the email to Samuel. The next morning, I received a message from Caroline. She hadn't contacted me directly in months. Hey, it read. I heard you've been upset. Can we talk? I waited an hour before responding. Not to be strategic. To be honest with myself. No, I typed back. Not right now. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Reappeared. You're really going to do this? She wrote. Do what? I asked. Make this hard. For everyone. I closed my eyes. This was the part of the story people rarely talk about. The way families recast self-defense as aggression. The way silence becomes violence, but speaking up becomes betrayal. I didn't make it hard, I typed. I just stopped making it easy. She didn't reply. Saturday came. My parents hosted an engagement dinner. I wasn't invited, but Daniel was. He called me afterward, voice low. They toasted Caroline and her future, he said. Dad gave a speech about legacy. And? I asked. And then Mom said something weird, he continued. She said, "It's so nice when everyone who matters is in the room." I felt the sting, but it didn't knock the wind out of me the way it once would have. Did anyone say my name? I asked. No, he said. Not once. I sat with that for a moment. Daniel, I said, I need to ask you something, and you need to answer honestly. Okay. Did you know they were planning to remove me before this? A long pause. I suspected, he admitted, but I didn't think they'd actually do it. That's how they get away with things, I said quietly. People think they won't. The following week, Samuel called again. They filed an amendment, he said. Sloppy one. How sloppy? They referenced a trust clause that doesn't apply, he replied. And they listed Caroline as sole successor trustee without proper vote. I smiled, despite myself. What does that mean? I asked. It means, Samuel said, they're rushing. The more they rushed, the clearer the pattern became. They were trying to finish everything before the wedding, before photos, before the optics of family unity were cemented. I attended a work conference in San Diego that week. On my name badge, my full name was printed clearly, Eleanor Price. I caught my reflection in a mirrored wall and thought about how strange it was that strangers could acknowledge my existence more easily than my own parents. On the last day of the conference, Samuel sent me a single sentence via email. We're ready when you are. I closed my laptop and went for a walk along the water. The sun was setting, couples laughed, families took pictures. I thought about my grandmother, who used to tell me that dignity wasn't something people gave you. It was something you took back. When I got home, I typed my reply. Proceed. What my parents didn't know yet was that while they were planning a wedding, I was preparing a filing that would freeze their accounts, halt their asset transfers, and force a judge to look very closely at how one daughter had vanished from the story. And once the court got involved, there would be no cropping me out. Not anymore. The filing went through on a Monday morning at 9:07 a.m. Samuel texted me first. It's done. No exclamation point, no drama, just 3 words that quietly shifted the balance of power. By noon, my phone started buzzing. I didn't answer. There's a moment after you set something irreversible in motion when the world feels oddly calm, like the air right before a storm breaks. I went about my day on purpose, answered emails, sat through a budget meeting, ate a salad I barely tasted. At 12:43 p.m., my father called. I let it ring. At 12:46, my mother. At 12:51, Caroline. I watched the screen light up and go dark until the device finally went silent. At 1:15 p.m., Daniel texted. What did you do? I stared at the message longer than necessary. I protected myself, I wrote back. You sued them? No, I replied. I enforced the trust. That distinction mattered more than anyone in my family would ever admit. I didn't sue out of anger. I didn't retaliate. I triggered a safeguard that had been sitting dormant for years, waiting for someone to cross a line. By mid-afternoon, Samuel called again. The judge granted a temporary freeze, he said. All transfers paused. No asset movement. Meaning? I asked. Meaning the vineyard deposit is locked, he said. The trust-backed loan they planned to use for the wedding venue? Frozen. I closed my eyes. Caroline's dream wedding was scheduled for 6 weeks from now. She'd chosen the vineyard because it symbolized legacy, family, continuity. Now, it symbolized something else entirely. They'll be furious, I said. They already are, Samuel replied. Your mother called my office. What did she say? That you're vindictive, he said dryly. That you've always been unstable. That you're punishing them for loving your sister. I laughed once, sharp and humorless. And you? I asked. I asked her, Samuel said, why the trust explicitly names you as a protected beneficiary if you were never meant to be involved. Silence on the other end of the line stretched longer than usual. She hung up, he added. That evening, Daniel showed up at my apartment, unannounced. Again, he looked like he hadn't slept. His tie was loosened, his jaw clenched in a way I recognized. He'd inherited that from our father. The look of someone who wanted peace more than justice, and was slowly realizing he couldn't have both. They're spiraling, he said as soon as I opened the door. I stepped aside and let him in. They think you're trying to ruin Caroline's wedding, he continued. Mom says you're jealous. Dad says this is unnecessary escalation. And what do you think? I asked. He hesitated, sat on my couch, ran his hands through his hair. I think, he said slowly, that they never thought you'd push back. I nodded. Neither did I, once. He looked up at me then. Really looked. You planned this, he said. I prepared for it, I corrected. There's a difference between aggression and readiness. I'd learned that the hard way. They're asking me to talk to you, he said, to convince you to drop it. Are you going to? I asked. He shook his head. No. That surprised both of us. I don't agree with everything you're doing, he admitted. But I can't pretend they didn't erase you. I watched it happen. I swallowed. Why didn't you say anything before? I asked quietly. Because I thought staying neutral meant staying good, he said. Turns out, it just meant staying quiet. That night, my mother sent me an email. Subject: Family emergency. Ellie, this has gone too far. We need to talk immediately. This legal action is damaging, unnecessary, and deeply hurtful. You are putting Caroline's future at risk over a misunderstanding. Please be reasonable. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to Samuel. No response. The next morning, a letter arrived from Caroline's fiancé, Mark. We'd met exactly twice. He was polite, unremarkable. The kind of man who believed marrying into a stable family meant marrying into safety. The letter was formal, controlled. Eleanor, I don't fully understand what's happening, but Caroline is under immense stress. If there's a way to resolve this privately, I urge you to consider it. Families should not be torn apart over money. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. Money wasn't what had torn us apart. That afternoon, Samuel called with an update. They're requesting mediation, he said. They want a closed-door settlement. Before the hearing? I asked. Yes. I thought about my mother's size, Caroline's confidence. The settlement envelope slid across the table like a favor. No, I said. Samuel didn't argue. They also filed a counterclaim, he added, claiming emotional distress. I smiled. That won't hold, I said. No, he agreed. But it will get messy. I can handle messy, I said. I grew up in it. That weekend, my parents hosted a brunch. A damage control brunch. Daniel told me afterward that my mother cried, that Caroline left early, that my father sat in silence, staring at his plate. They were losing control of the narrative. And for people like them, that was worse than losing money. Late Sunday night, I received a voicemail from my father. Not angry, not pleading. Tired. Ellie, he said, we made mistakes, but this isn't how families solve problems. I didn't call him back, because families like ours don't solve problems. They bury them, rename them, pretend they don't exist. I wasn't interested in solving anything anymore. I was interested in boundaries, and the court date was approaching faster than anyone expected. What my parents still didn't understand was this. The freeze wasn't the punishment. It was the pause. The moment before everything they'd carefully arranged was examined under a light they could no longer control. The first crack in my mother's composure came 5 days before the hearing. She showed up at my office. Not the lobby, not the parking lot. She walked straight past the receptionist like she owned the place, heels sharp against the tile, chin lifted, wearing the same tailored coat she reserved for church and funerals. Judith Price never appeared uninvited, unless she believed she still had authority. "Eleanor," she said, standing in the doorway of my office as if the word tasted unfamiliar. "We need to talk." My coworkers pretended not to watch. Everyone always pretends, but no one ever misses a thing. I closed the file on my desk calmly. "You should leave." Her smile flickered. "This is ridiculous. I'm your mother." "And this is my workplace," I replied. "You're trespassing." That stopped her. She stepped inside anyway, lowering her voice. "You think this makes you powerful? Dragging us into court?" I met her eyes. For the first time in my life, I didn't look away. "I didn't drag anyone," I said. "You filed. You excluded." I responded. Her jaw tightened. "You've always been like this, watching, keeping score." I almost laughed. "No," I said quietly. "I learned to document because no one believed me." That landed harder than I expected. I saw it in her face. The split second where she understood I wasn't improvising anymore. I was finished negotiating reality. "You're humiliating your sister," she hissed. "I'm not responsible for protecting Caroline from consequences," I said. "You are." She stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. "You used to be grateful," she said finally. "For what?" I asked. She opened her mouth, then closed it, because even she knew how hollow that question was. Security arrived before she could regroup. I didn't call them. Someone else had. As she was escorted out, she turned back once. "You'll regret this." I watched her go, pulse steady. I already regretted waiting this long. That evening, Samuel sent me the latest filings. My parents' legal team was scrambling. Their arguments contradicted earlier statements. Dates didn't align. Caroline's name appeared where it legally shouldn't have. "They're building on sand," Samuel wrote. "But they're desperate. Desperate people take risks." The next day, Daniel called me at dawn. "They're trying to sell the warehouse in Fresno," he said. Quietly. "Off the books." I sat up in bed. "That's trust property." "I know," he said. "I heard Dad arguing with the accountant." "They can't," I said. "It's frozen." "They're trying anyway." I forwarded the information to Samuel immediately. An hour later, he called. "They just violated the court order," he said, voice sharp. "That's not a mistake. That's contempt." My stomach dropped. Not from fear, but from something colder. "They're going to blame me," I said. "They already tried," he replied. The judge didn't buy it. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine the hearing not as a battle, but as an exposure. That weekend would have been Caroline's bridal shower. Instead, it was canceled. No explanation posted, no photos shared, just silence. I knew my mother well enough to understand what that meant. The optics were unraveling. Friends were asking questions. Church acquaintances were whispering. The narrative she'd curated for decades was fraying at the edges. On Sunday afternoon, Caroline called. I almost didn't answer. Almost. "What do you want?" I asked. She was crying. Not the performative kind. The messy, uneven kind that comes when the ground shifts under you. "They're saying it's all your fault," she said. "That if you just stayed out of it, none of this would be happening." I leaned against my kitchen counter, closed my eyes. "And what do you think?" I asked. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know what's real anymore." That was the closest she'd ever come to honesty. "You're not the only one," I said. I spent years wondering if I imagined it. There was a long pause. "Why didn't you fight sooner?" she asked. "Because I thought love meant endurance. Because I thought silence was maturity. Because I didn't know I was allowed to choose myself." "I wasn't ready," I said instead. She sniffed. "I'm scared." "So am I admitted. "But fear doesn't mean you're wrong." She didn't respond. When the call ended, nothing was resolved. But something had shifted. 2 days before the hearing, a courier delivered a package to my apartment. No return address. Inside was a copy of my parents' revised will. Not filed, not notarized, just printed. My name appeared once. Excluded. Tucked inside was a handwritten note from my father. We never meant to hurt you. This got out of hand. Please reconsider. I stared at his handwriting, neat and controlled, and felt something inside me finally settle. This wasn't about misunderstanding. It was about control. I called Samuel. They're trying to intimidate you, he said after I explained. Softly. They're hoping you'll fold. I won't, I said. I know, he replied, but there's something else. What? They underestimated you in one critical way, he said. I waited. They assumed you wanted back in. The realization hit me like cold water. I don't, I said slowly. No, Samuel agreed. And that changes everything. The night before the hearing, I laid out my clothes like armor. Not black, not dramatic. Gray, neutral, professional. I reviewed my notes one last time. Not arguments, facts. At midnight, I stood by my window, city quiet beneath me, and understood something with absolute clarity. Tomorrow wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming the right to stand in the room where decisions about my life were made. And this time, no one would decide for me. The courthouse smelled like old paper and disinfectant. I arrived early, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to see the room before it filled with people who had once decided I didn't belong in it. Samuel met me outside the courtroom. He looked exactly the same as always. Calm, measured, unimpressed by theatrics. He nodded once, a small gesture that told me everything I needed to know. They're already here, he said. I didn't ask who. I knew. When we walked in, I saw them immediately. My parents sat together in the front row, close enough to touch, but not touching. My mother's posture was rigid, hands folded too tightly in her lap. My father stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, like a man waiting for a verdict he already suspected would go against him. Caroline sat 2 rows behind them, flanked by Mark. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her eyes met mine for half a second, then dropped. Daniel wasn't there. That didn't surprise me. Daniel avoided moments that forced him to choose sides. Silence was his last refuge. I took my seat next to Samuel. No one spoke to me. No one acknowledged me. For years, that would have hurt. Now, it felt familiar, manageable. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Judge Eleanor Walsh, late 50s, sharp eyes. The kind of woman who had spent decades watching people lie badly. She adjusted her glasses and glanced at the file. This is a petition to enforce a trust and address alleged violations of fiduciary duty, she said. I've reviewed the preliminary filings. Her gaze lifted, landed briefly on my parents. And I have questions. Samuel stood when it was our turn. He spoke plainly, no dramatics. He laid out the trust structure, my grandfather's intent, the protections built in to prevent exactly what had happened. When it was the other side's turn, my parents' attorney stood. He was younger, polished, overconfident. This is a family disagreement that has escalated unnecessarily, he began. My clients were attempting to simplify an outdated arrangement. Judge Walsh raised a hand. Counsel, she said, I'm going to stop you there. The room went very still. You don't simplify a trust by removing a named beneficiary without cause, she continued. And you don't attempt asset transfers under an active freeze. The attorney hesitated. There may have been miscommunication. No, the judge said calmly. There was intent. I felt Samuel shift beside me, just slightly. Approval. Judge Walsh turned a page in the file. Mrs. Price, she said, looking directly at my mother. Did you instruct your accountant to pursue the sale of the Fresno warehouse after this court issued a temporary freeze? My mother's lips parted. Closed. Parted again. I don't recall, she said. Judge Walsh's eyes didn't waver. Would it refresh your memory to know that we have an email time-stamped 46 minutes after the order was issued? The judge asked. A murmur rippled through the room. My father finally looked at me, not with anger, with something closer to fear. Their attorney scrambled. Your Honor, my clients were under considerable stress. So is everyone who appears in this courtroom, Judge Walsh said. Stress does not excuse contempt. She turned back to Samuel. Mr. Green, she said, you're requesting enforcement and corrective action. Yes, Your Honor, he replied, including restoration of my client's status and removal of parties who violated fiduciary responsibility. The word removal hung in the air. My mother inhaled sharply. Judge Walsh leaned back in her chair. "I'm granting the enforcement," she said, "effective immediately." My heart didn't race. It slowed. "All attempted amendments are nullified," the judge continued. "The trust will revert to its previous structure. Additionally," she paused, eyes on my parents, "given the violation of court order and attempted concealment of assets, I am ordering an independent trustee to be appointed." Carolyn gasped softly. My mother went very still. "That means," Judge Walsh said, "Mr. and Mrs. Price will no longer have unilateral control over trust assets." It was done. No shouting, no gavel slam, just a quiet transfer of power. The judge looked at me then. "Miss Price," she said, "you did the right thing by bringing this forward." I nodded. That was all. The hearing ended less than an hour after it began. Outside the courtroom, chaos waited. My mother rushed toward me, eyes bright with unshed tears. "How could you do this to us?" she demanded. "To your own family?" Samuel stepped slightly in front of me. "My client has nothing further to discuss," he said. "I wasn't speaking to you," my mother snapped. I met her gaze calmly. "I know," I said. "That's the problem." She froze. My father lingered behind her, shoulders slumped. "Ellie," he said quietly, "we never thought it would come to this." "I did," I replied. "That's why I prepared." Caroline hovered nearby, torn between worlds. "You won," she said, voice hollow. I shook my head. "No," I said. "I stopped losing." That distinction mattered. Daniel called me later that night. "I heard," he said. "About the trustee." "Yes," I replied. "They're furious," he added. "But I think they're also scared." "They should be," I said gently. "Not of me. Of what happens when you can't control the story anymore." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know where this leaves us," he said. "Neither do I admitted. "But for the first time, that's not terrifying." When the call ended, I sat alone in my apartment, the city humming outside, and felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not triumph, relief. The court had restored my position, on paper, but the real shift had already happened. I no longer needed their approval to exist. And the people who built their power on my silence had just learned what happens when that silence ends. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in waves. The first wave was quiet. Emails unanswered, calls redirected to attorneys, invitations rescinded without explanation. My mother's social circle, once so eager to include me when it was convenient, suddenly forgot my name again. Only this time, I noticed the difference. They weren't erasing me. They were avoiding me. 3 days after the hearing, Samuel forwarded me a notice from the court-appointed trustee. Her name was Margaret Liu, early 60s, former probate judge, known for one thing above all else. She didn't tolerate nonsense. She requested individual meetings with each beneficiary. Mine was scheduled first. I arrived at her office with a slim folder. I didn't bring arguments. I brought documentation. That had become my language. Margaret greeted me with a firm handshake and a measuring look. "I've read the file," she said. "I'm not interested in family drama. I'm interested in compliance." "Then we'll get along," I replied. She almost smiled. She asked me about my role in the company, my relationship with the trust, my expectations. "I don't want control," I told her. "I want transparency, and I want my rights respected." She nodded. "That's refreshingly reasonable." I left her office lighter than I'd felt in weeks. My parents' meeting went very differently, Daniel told me later. He'd been called in afterward, visibly shaken. She asked them to explain their decisions, he said. Not emotionally, logically. "And?" I asked. "They couldn't," he admitted. "Mom kept talking about loyalty. Dad talked about tradition. Neither could explain why you were excluded without contradicting themselves." I pictured my mother, used to being believed because she sounded sincere, confronted by someone who cared only about facts. Good. The second wave came publicly. The wedding venue canceled. Officially, it was due to unresolved financial arrangements. Unofficially, the trustee had flagged the trust-backed payment as improper. Caroline called me that night. "I had to tell people it was postponed," she said. "Not canceled, postponed." Her voice sounded brittle. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. There was a pause. "I don't think I ever asked you this," she said slowly. Did you want to be part of the business? Yes, I replied. For a long time. Why didn't you say something? I closed my eyes. I did, I said. You just weren't listening. Silence again. I don't know how to fix this, she whispered. That's not your job, I said. It never was. After we hung up, I sat in the dark and felt something unexpected. Grief, not for the family I'd lost, for the one I'd never really had. The third wave hit at work. My boss called me into her office, concern etched across her face. I need to ask you something, she said. And you don't have to answer. I nodded. Is everything okay? She asked. There were calls from my family, I said. Yes. They're unhappy I enforced a legal agreement, I replied. That's all. She studied me for a moment. Are you at risk? She asked. No, I said. But they are uncomfortable. She smiled slightly. Good. She closed the folder on her desk. You've been promoted, she said. Senior Compliance Director. Effective immediately. I blinked. I didn't know that was on the table. It wasn't, she said. Until we watched how you handled pressure. I walked out of her office with a new title and an old understanding. Competence makes some people proud. It makes others dangerous. That evening, my father showed up at my apartment, alone. No warning, no theatrics. He looked older than he had at the courthouse. Smaller. I won't stay long, he said. I let him in anyway. He stood in the middle of my living room like a guest, unsure where to sit. I should have stopped her, he said quietly, years ago. I didn't answer. I told myself keeping the peace was protecting the family, he continued. But all I did was teach them you were expendable. The word landed heavily. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he said. I know I don't deserve it. I studied him. The man who had taught me to ride a bike. The man who had watched me be erased. What do you want? I asked. To tell you the truth, he said. For once, I nodded. Then do that, he exhaled. Your mother resented you, he admitted, because you reminded her of a version of herself she hated. The struggling years, the uncertainty. Caroline was born when things were stable, when success came. Loving her was easy. I absorbed that, quietly. And me? I asked. You were inconvenient, he said, and instead of protecting you, I protected her. Quiet. I didn't respond. He turned toward the door. I don't expect a relationship, he said, but I wanted you to hear it from me. Thank you, I said. He paused. For what? For finally telling the truth, I replied. When the door closed behind him, I sank onto the couch and stared at the wall. The waves had passed. What remained was clarity. My parents hadn't acted out of love or hate. They'd acted out of fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of imperfection. Fear of being seen. And fear, I'd learned, was a terrible foundation for family. The trust was restored. The business was under oversight. The wedding was postponed. The image was cracked. But the most important change hadn't happened in court. It had happened quietly, inside me. I no longer felt the pull to fix them. I no longer needed them to understand. I had stepped out of the role they assigned me. And once you do that, you don't fit back into the story the same way. Not ever again. The silence after the fallout was heavier than the conflict itself. No texts from my mother. No passive-aggressive emails. No updates funneled through Daniel. It was as if someone had finally unplugged a machine that had been humming in the background of my life for decades. At first, the quiet felt suspicious. I kept waiting for another move, another tactic, another attempt to regain control through guilt or urgency. When you grow up in a family that operates on manipulation, peace never feels accidental. But days passed. Then a week. Nothing. Margaret Liu sent a formal update outlining the next steps. A full audit of the trust and its connected entities. Review of governance at Price & Sons. Interviews with key staff. This was no longer personal. It was procedural. And that was exactly what my parents feared most. Daniel called midweek. They're being audited internally, too, he said. Margaret requested access to 10 years of records. That's standard, I replied. For a normal situation, he said. This isn't normal for them. I pictured my mother, who believed good intentions excused poor documentation, confronted with spreadsheets and timelines that didn't care how earnest she sounded. What about you, I asked. How are you holding up? He hesitated. I'm reconsidering things. Like what? My role, he said. In the business. In the family. I didn't comment. Growth doesn't need encouragement. It needs space. The following Friday, I received an email from Margaret. Subject: participation opportunity. She wanted to know if I'd consider joining the advisory board temporarily. Not as a trustee, not as an executive, as an independent voice representing beneficiary interests. I read the email twice. It wasn't power, it was presence. I accepted. The first board meeting was tense. My parents sat across from me for the first time since the hearing. No legal buffer, no script. My mother didn't look at me. My father did, then looked away. Margaret opened the meeting crisply. Agenda, objectives, expectations. When discussion turned to asset allocation, my mother interjected. This level of oversight feels excessive, she said. We've managed this responsibly for years. Margaret didn't blink. Respectfully, she replied, the current situation suggests otherwise. I watched my mother's lips press into a thin line. Later, when Margaret asked for input from all parties, I spoke once, just once. I'd like transparency around decision-making going forward, I said. Specifically, written rationales for changes affecting beneficiaries. It was neutral, reasonable. My mother finally looked at me then, not angry, cornered. The meeting adjourned without incident. But afterward, in the parking lot, Caroline approached me, alone. I didn't know about the Fresno warehouse, she said quietly. I know, I replied. They never told me, she continued, about the trust changes either. They just said things were complicated. I studied her face, the confusion, the cracks in certainty. I believed them, she said, because it was easier. I nodded. It usually is. She swallowed. Mark and I are reevaluating things. That didn't surprise me. When foundations shake, everything built on them trembles. That weekend, I visited my grandmother's old house again. Margaret had requested access for the audit, and I volunteered to be present. The house felt different now, less haunted, more honest. In the study, I found something I'd missed before, a small notebook tucked behind a drawer. My grandfather's handwriting filled the pages, notes about the business, about the trust, about his children, and then about me. Ellie sees what others avoid. She asks questions that make people uncomfortable. This will either make her powerful or make her a target. I sat down slowly. He'd known. At the end of the notebook was a single line. If they try to erase her, it will be because they fear what she represents. I closed the book and felt something warm and steady spread through my chest. Validation doesn't always come from the people who hurt you. Sometimes it comes from the ones who saw you clearly and prepared the ground for your survival. The following week, Margaret called another meeting. This one shorter, sharper. She announced the results of preliminary findings. Irregularities, poor documentation, conflicts of interest. No criminal referrals yet. My mother's face drained of color. My father stared at the table. I will be implementing stricter controls, Margaret said, including limitations on discretionary spending and mandatory reporting. She turned to me briefly. Thank you for your cooperation. Afterward, Daniel caught up with me. I'm stepping down, he said. From what? Executive role, he replied. I can't pretend this didn't happen. I searched his face. What will you do? I don't know, he admitted. But for the first time, I'm choosing something because it feels right, not because it's expected. I smiled faintly. That's new for our family. That night, alone in my apartment, I made a decision. I blocked my mother's number, not out of anger, out of clarity. She had nothing left to say that would move me forward. The trust was protected. The business was under watch. The truth was documented. I poured myself a glass of wine and stood by the window, city lights flickering below. For years, I thought survival meant staying small. Now I understood something else. Survival had only been the beginning. What came next was ownership of my choices, my boundaries, my life. And no one else got to edit that anymore. The apology arrived in a white envelope with no return address. That was how I knew it was from my mother. She'd always believed removing identifiers made things feel less confrontational. as if anonymity could soften accountability. I didn't open it right away. I placed it on my dining table and let it sit there for 2 days, unopened, like a question I wasn't obligated to answer. When I finally did open it, the letter was 3 pages long. It began the way all her apologies did. "I never meant to hurt you." I read slowly. She wrote about pressure, about expectations, about how hard it was to keep the family together. She wrote about Caroline's wedding falling apart, about the shame she felt at church, about how people no longer looked at her the same way. Only once did my name appear. "Ellie, I hope someday you can understand." I stopped there. Understanding had never been the issue. The problem was that she still saw my pain as collateral damage to her own discomfort. I folded the letter neatly and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't respond. That same afternoon, Margaret called. "The audit is expanding," she said. "We've uncovered additional discrepancies." "How serious?" I asked. "Serious enough that your parents' counsel is advising them to cooperate fully," she replied. "And to stop contacting you," I smiled. "That advice came too late," I said. She laughed softly. "Perhaps, but you should be aware of one thing." "What's that?" "The trust contains a clause your parents appear to have forgotten," she said. "A conditional disbursement tied to beneficiary engagement." I leaned forward. "Explain." "Your grandfather included a provision," she said, "that rewards beneficiaries who actively protect the trust's integrity." I didn't speak. "Given your actions," Margaret continued, "you qualify." "For what?" I asked. She named the number. I sat back in my chair, stunned. It wasn't just money. It was acknowledgement. A tangible confirmation that my grandfather had anticipated this outcome and designed a safeguard that didn't require me to beg for justice. "What do I need to do?" I asked. "Nothing," she said. "It's already in motion." That evening, Caroline showed up at my apartment. No warning, no makeup, no rehearsed expression. She looked like someone who'd finally run out of narratives. "I read the trust documents," she said after I let her in. "All of them." I waited. "You were never supposed to be excluded," she continued. "Not legally, not morally." "No," I said. "I wasn't." She sat on my couch, hands shaking slightly. "They told me you didn't care," she said, "that you chose not to be involved." "And you believed them," I said. "Yes," she whispered. "Because believing them meant I didn't have to question everything else." I sat across from her. "This isn't about punishing you," I said. "It never was." She looked up. "Then what is it about?" "Choice," I replied. "I didn't have one. Now I do." She nodded slowly. "Mark left," she said. "Not because of you. Because he realized he didn't know who he was marrying." I didn't comment. "I don't know who I am either," she added. "That's not a failure," I said. "It's a beginning." She stayed for an hour. We talked carefully, honestly. For the first time in our adult lives, there was no competition between us, no script to follow. When she left, she hugged me. It wasn't the kind of hug we'd practiced for family photos. It was real. The next week, the funds were deposited. I stared at the numbers on my screen longer than I expected to. Then I did something my mother would never have done. I called my financial advisor. We talked about long-term plans, investments, philanthropy, stability, not appearances. I set up a scholarship fund in my grandfather's name for students who'd been quietly pushed aside in family businesses, who'd been told to be grateful instead of equal. I didn't announce it. I just did it. At work, my promotion settled in. I was asked to mentor junior staff, to sit in rooms where policies were written, not just enforced. At one meeting, someone referred to me as a stabilizing presence. I smiled to myself. Stability, I'd learned, isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about being able to withstand it without losing yourself. Daniel called one night, voice lighter than I'd heard in years. "I applied for a job," he said, "outside the company." "Good," I replied. "I don't know if I'll get it," he added. "You will," I said. "But even if you don't, you've already done the hardest part." "What's that?" "You chose differently," I said. That night, I sat on my balcony, city humming below, and thought about how far I'd come from the woman holding an invitation that excluded her from her own family. I thought about how easily I could have folded, signed the settlement, stayed quiet, and how heavy that silence would have been. The letter from my mother still sat unopened on my table. It would remain there, not as a wound, as a reminder that apologies without accountability are just another form of control. And I was done accepting those completely. The call came on Thanksgiving morning. I almost didn't answer. The turkey was in the oven. The apartment smelled like sage and butter. Daniel was due to arrive in an hour. Caroline had texted the night before, asking if she could stop by later. No expectations, no pressure. For the first time in years, the holiday felt like something I'd chosen, not endured. The phone buzzed again. Unknown number, I answered. Ellie, my mother said. Her voice was smaller than I remembered. Not weak, just stripped of performance. I didn't know who else to call. I closed my eyes. What happened? I asked. Your instinct doesn't soften when you heal. It sharpens. You learn to distinguish urgency from manipulation. The trustee froze the discretionary account, she said. The one I used for personal expenses. Yes, I replied. That was in the notice. They won't release funds without approval, she continued. And your father? He's furious. He says this is all because of you. I leaned against the counter. Steady. It's because of choices, I said. Not me. A pause. We can't host Thanksgiving, she said finally. Everything's complicated. I pictured the long dining table, the carefully arranged centerpieces, the performance of togetherness she'd curated for decades. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it in the way you're sorry when a storm cancels a flight, acknowledging inconvenience, not guilt. People will ask questions, she added. They already are, I said. Silence. I need your help, she said. There it was. The ask that had always come disguised as family duty. No, I replied calmly. She inhaled sharply. After everything we've done for you, I'm going to stop you there, I said. If you need financial assistance, you should speak to the trustee. If you need emotional support, you should speak to a therapist. I am not the bridge between you and consequences anymore. Her breath caught. You sound rehearsed, she said. I sound clear, I replied. She didn't argue. She just hung up. I stood there for a moment, phone in my hand, waiting for the familiar aftershock. The guilt, the doubt, the pull to call back and soften. It never came. Daniel arrived carrying 2 bottles of wine and a cautious smile. She called me too, he said as he set them down. Let me guess, I said. It was an emergency. He nodded. She wanted me to convince you to talk to her. And? I asked. And I told her no, he said. For the first time in my life. I looked at him. Really looked. He stood straighter than he used to. Less apologetic. More present. I'm proud of you, I said. Dinner was quiet. Easy. We talked about work, about nothing, about everything that didn't revolve around managing our parents' emotions. Later, Caroline arrived. She brought a pie from a bakery across town. Not homemade, not symbolic, just thoughtful. Thank you for letting me come, she said softly. You're welcome, I replied. We ate together. No speeches, no pretending. When the conversation drifted toward childhood, it stayed factual, grounded, no rewriting. No minimizing. After dessert, Caroline lingered while Daniel cleaned up. I found something, she said. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was my grandmother's ring. She left it to all of us, Caroline said. Mom kept it. I didn't know. I found it during the audit. I stared at the ring. I remembered my grandmother wearing it every day, turning it when she was thinking. I want you to have it, Caroline said. Not because of the trust, because it's right. I hesitated. Then I took it. Thank you, I said. She exhaled, like she'd been holding that breath for years. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone with the ring on my finger. It fit perfectly. The next week, the audit concluded. Margaret sent a final report. Clear, thorough, unforgiving. My parents retained partial access to assets, but lost all discretionary authority. The business was restructured with independent oversight. No more unilateral decisions. No more quiet exclusions. The system my grandfather built had finally been activated the way he intended. My mother sent one last message. I understand now that I lost you long before the court did. I read it once. Then I archived it. Some realizations arrived too late to repair anything. but they can still mark an ending. At work, I was asked to lead a new initiative. High visibility, high trust. As I prepared for the presentation, I caught my reflection in the glass wall of the conference room. I didn't look smaller anymore. I looked settled. The girl who learned to survive by staying quiet had grown into a woman who understood that silence is only powerful when you choose it. Everything else is erasure. Thanksgiving ended without drama, without spectacle, just choice. And that, I realized, was the real inheritance. The lawsuit my parents never expected arrived 2 weeks before Christmas. Not from me, from the minority shareholders. Once the audit report circulated, it didn't stay contained. It never does. Documents have a way of escaping the rooms they're meant to stay in, especially when too many people suddenly realize they've been trusting the wrong hands. Price & Sons had always marketed itself as a family-first company. Quiet, stable, reliable. But the audit revealed years of blurred lines between personal spending and corporate assets. Nothing dramatic enough for headlines. Enough to erode trust. That was all it took. Margaret called me the morning the suit was filed. "I wanted you to hear it from me," she said. "This is not your responsibility." "I know," I replied. "And yet," she added gently, "it is a consequence of the same behavior." Yes, it was. My parents' attorney requested an emergency board meeting. This time, Daniel attended as an observer. Caroline declined. I sat at the table, hands folded, listening as lawyers spoke in careful language about exposure, liability, and risk mitigation. My mother spoke once. "We built this company," she said, voice tight. "We sacrificed everything for it." Margaret looked at her steadily. "And in doing so," she replied, "you forgot. It was never meant to belong to you alone." That sentence ended the discussion. After the meeting, my father caught up with me in the hallway. "I don't recognize our life anymore," he said quietly. I stopped walking. "You never recognized mine," I replied. He nodded. No argument, just acceptance. That was new. The next day, Caroline called. "I'm moving," she said. "Out of their house." "Good," I replied. "I found a small place near the coast," she continued. "Nothing fancy, just mine." "Good," I said again. She laughed softly. "You're very consistent." "I had practice," I said. Christmas approached differently than it ever had before. No coordinated cards, no matching sweaters, no forced traditions. Daniel hosted a small dinner at his place. Caroline came. So did 2 of Daniel's friends I barely knew. We ate takeout and drank cheap wine and didn't pretend to be anything other than what we were. At one point, Daniel raised his glass. "To choosing differently," he said. We clinked glasses. That night, I drove home through streets lit with decorations I hadn't noticed in years. I thought about how often I'd tried to earn my place, to be indispensable, invisible, easy, and how none of that had ever made me safe. The safety came later, when I stopped negotiating my worth. The final meeting with Margaret took place 3 days after Christmas. She closed the file in front of her. "The trust is stabilized," she said. "Your role on the advisory board is no longer required." I nodded. Understood. She paused. "However," she continued, "there is an opening on the governance committee of another trust I oversee. Different family, similar dynamics." I smiled faintly. "I'll think about it," I said. "You'd be good at it," she said. "You see clearly." I left her office feeling lighter than I had in years. Not because the conflict was over, but because it no longer defined me. On New Year's Eve, my mother sent one final message. "I hope someday we can be a family again." I read it. I didn't respond. Because family, I'd learned, isn't something you return to. It's something you build, with people who don't require you to disappear to belong. As midnight approached, I stood on my balcony, city alive below me, and let the year end without ceremony. I wasn't waiting for reconciliation. I wasn't hoping for karma. I had already chosen myself. And that choice had changed everything. The last document arrived in January, after the holidays had passed and the noise had finally settled. It wasn't dramatic. No legal threats. No emotional language. Just confirmation. The restructuring of Price & Sons was complete. The trust was locked into independent governance. My parents retained limited benefits but no authority. Caroline and Daniel were listed as beneficiaries under clear, non-negotiable terms. So was I, equally. For the first time in my life, my name appeared where it always should have been, without explanation or apology attached. I read the document once, then closed the folder. That chapter was finished. I didn't celebrate. I didn't call anyone. I didn't post anything or mark the moment with symbolism. I went to work. I came home. I cooked dinner. That's how real endings usually look. Quiet, unremarkable, final. A week later, my father emailed me. Not my mother. Just him. I'm stepping away from the company. Early retirement. It's time. I stared at the screen longer than I expected. Then I typed back one sentence. I hope you find peace. I meant it. In the way you mean something when you no longer need anything from the outcome. Caroline invited me to coffee the following weekend. Not to talk about the family. Not to process the past. She wanted advice on a lease agreement. We sat by the window of a small cafe near the water, papers spread between us, two grown women doing ordinary things. At one point, she looked up at me. You know, she said, I used to think strength looked like being chosen. I waited. Now I think it looks like choosing yourself, she finished. I nodded. It took me a while to learn that too. Daniel called later that night. I got the job, he said. Out of state. That's great, I replied. I'm scared, he admitted. So was I said. That's how you know it matters. Spring came slowly that year. I started running in the mornings. Nothing intense, just enough to feel my body move without tension. I donated my grandmother's ring to the scholarship fund I'd created, turning it into something that would outlive all of us. I accepted Margaret's offer to sit on another governance committee. Different family, same pattern. This time, when the eldest daughter spoke quietly at the table and no one listened, I noticed. I always notice now. My mother never called again. Occasionally, I heard updates through other people. Therapy, volunteer work, attempts at reinvention. I wished her well from a distance. Distance, I'd learned, is not cruelty. It's clarity. One evening, as I was cleaning out old boxes, I found the wedding invitation that had started everything. The cream envelope. The careful omission. I held it for a moment, then tore it cleanly in half and dropped it into the trash. Not out of anger, out of closure. Here's the truth I wish someone had told me sooner. Being excluded doesn't always look like hatred. Sometimes it looks like concern. Sometimes it looks like protection. Sometimes it looks like this is just how things are. But when you're consistently left out of decisions that shape your life, that's not love. That's control. And when people only value you as long as you're quiet, compliant, and grateful for scraps, the most dangerous thing you can do is stand up calmly and say no. Not loudly, not emotionally, not to convince anyone, just no. I didn't destroy my family. I stopped letting them decide who I was allowed to be. The revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. There was no public shaming or dramatic confrontation. It was paperwork, deadlines, boundaries. It was choosing dignity over approval. And when the tables finally turned, I didn't gloat. I walked away. Because the real payback isn't watching someone fall. It's realizing you no longer need them to stand. If you're listening to this and something in your chest feels tight, if you've ever been made to feel difficult, ungrateful, or invisible by the people who are supposed to love you most, hear this clearly. You are not wrong for wanting fairness. You are not selfish for protecting yourself. And you are not obligated to stay where you are diminished. Choosing yourself doesn't make you heartless. It makes you free. If this story resonated with you, if you've lived some version of it, leave a comment. I read them. All of them. And if you want more stories about family drama, betrayal, inheritance, and the quiet kind of revenge that actually lasts, like, subscribe, and stay. Some endings don't look like victory. They look like peace. And that's better.